everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Public Announcement Podcast. And today we have an interesting topic, or a very relevant one, and that is about the corona outbreak. I actually wanted to do this video or this podcast for quite a while, but I didn't realize maybe 2 weeks ago when I was writing down ideas that the pandemic would get so serious, but here we are. And that is also the reason you might maybe experience a little bit of sound quality drop. It is not because you're hearing bad or your headphones are bad. It is because I have to work with the setup I currently have. I do not have access to my home setup. So yeah, please just hold with me, and yeah, I hope I will get back to my normal setup as soon as possible. So in order to understand the pandemic or the corona outbreak, you don't have to watch the news 24/7. I guess everybody who has at least gets a very basic idea of what happened, where it originated, how it spread, and therefore we don't have to go into deep details about this. And I'm not going to talk about this either. I'm more going to talk about the future implications on humankind and, generally speaking, the world, maybe. You can call it like that. That's going to be the main topic we're going to talk about it. It is not, in my opinion, the pandemic itself, but it's how people reacted to it that's the most interesting part. Yes, the pandemic is dangerous. Yes, the pandemic is deadly. But I think that the human factor was the thing that made the entire thing even worse and made it collapse. And I don't think that the world as it is today is ready for another pandemic if it is as serious as the coronavirus, or maybe even more serious. We maybe don't imagine if corona was more deadly or could spread more easily, how many people could have been infected and how could it inflict, what kind of damage it would inflict on our world. I don't want to be rude, I don't want to make the entire issue not serious, but it's not that bad if you look at it from a global perspective. Right? Of course, it's time to maybe panic a little. Of course, it's time to prepare. Of course, there have been many deaths and many people are in panic. Many people are quarantined. But if you look at it, there hasn't been that many people infected, and many people died. Yes, that's an unfortunate thing. But imagine if maybe 1 billion people would be infected. That's still 1/7 of the world. If we talk about that, that's not the majority of the world, right? 1/7 of the world would be infected by a disease, and that's 1 billion, right? And I don't think the corona cases, no matter what happens, will ever reach 1 billion. I don't think they will even reach maybe 100 or 10 million, right? So just imagine a disease. I'm talking about a disease on that scale, right? So what was the biggest failure, in my opinion, was the entire check and the entire checking of people and the transportation in general. I mean, when the disease first began, people were still kind of free to travel around. I think the first travel bans came around February or at the end of February. At March, or as we are as of today, there are many bans. You know, countries cannot travel freely. There is nobody almost in the planes. I think some of the flights are even empty, like absolutely, like it's just a fucking airplane flying. And trains and buses are also limited only to use in the countries, and that also, of course, is not true worldwide. But before, you could very freely travel in an airplane, and even when people started to get rejected from their flights because of coronavirus, there still was the problem of the transportation by train and by bus. Now, for people living in the United States, you might not think that this is something very serious to consider, but if you live in Europe, you can literally get in a few hours across maybe 3 or 4 countries if you take a train. And I do remember, in my country specifically, the buses that were coming from Italy at the peak of them spreading, like the first week, when Italians started to understand this shit's getting serious, the buses that came to my country were completely unchecked. The people just got out of the bus and left, and the buses were coming out of zones that today are heavily quarantined and guarded. Zones where people are literally dying in hospitals and on the streets at homes. These were the zones where the buses were sort of like going, and 3 days later these buses appeared in my country and nobody really checked them. The same with trains. And a lot of people also took it as a holiday destination, right? So many people, many ski people came from Italy back to the country. Still, it was not checked. Those were by cars. Now today, of course, we have closed borders. It's more checked, and at least in my country, all the buses are limited to regional use, and trains also. You cannot get by a train out of the country. You can only take a car and go through the borders where you are checked if you don't have the coronavirus directly. Now, but the most important failure, or the biggest one failure, was, in my opinion, the human factor. Now, in my opinion, everybody is sort of guilty out of this because lots of people underestimated the virus and some people overestimated it and were just straight up panicking, and those people were not helping the situation either. In my opinion, people are not mentally ready to do this. People are not ready or are not prepared for this type of serious disease or a serious lockdown, right? Even after the quarantine, I remember this fully because I also did it, right? So the first week of the so-called quarantine, they told us we should rather stay at home and we should rather do this, but most of the people didn't quite ignore it. They just sort of like continued with their normal lives, right? They went to work, after work they went to sit down, and it is not really the ideal situation you should be doing. Now, of course, we are now smarter, but again, people didn't take it that seriously. And of course, there were those people that 2 months ago were stockpiling on food because they thought there is an apocalypse. I mean, those people didn't add to the conversation much either. There are cases, also in my country and I believe in others, where people just buy insane amounts of whatever product is currently not in the stock. People started buying toilet paper. In my country, at least, it was like flour and pasta. You're stockpiling like for 10 years of a nuclear holocaust. I mean, that also isn't a solution, and you're just creating more panic, which doesn't need to be. And I think the governments also underestimated the human factor. They just sort of said like, okay, we recommend this, and whoever like does otherwise won't be punished. So of course the people won't change their behavior. If the people were given a punishment or a penalty, I think it would really help the spread of the coronavirus to sort of slow down. The spread wouldn't be so fast, or people would stay at home more, and it would be maybe a 1 week or a 2 week quarantine instead of an almost 3 week one, at least in my country right now. And if two sides are diametrally different, one starts to panic and one makes fun of it, you can't get a middle consensus. You don't know whom to believe, because one of the things we're spreading fake news about how really bad it was and how we are all gonna die, and the second side was sort of like chilling there and saying like, okay, no, nothing is gonna happen, and neither of them were in the right at the end of the day. And also another thing that, in my opinion at least, failed was the governments, but I don't think they're so guilty of this. I just think they don't have the tools ready to handle such disease. Many governments, they don't have policies or steps to take in case of this government, or at least what I saw, right? Because everybody was sort of confused what to do. They closed up schools, and then they were like, okay, what now? Do we close up also people who work, or do we limit public transport? Each country had their individual own sort of policies that they used, and it was more like, at least in my country, we are currently under the regime that was made in case of an attack, like a military attack, right? It is not like specifically made for a pandemic or specifically made for a disease. It is made for like when there is an attack, like an actual military attack. These are the steps we have to take in order to ensure the country survives. And that is not really a good way to approach this. Many people, they didn't want to stay at home. They went out, and the government had no means of saying like, okay, just go stay home. It was mostly public speeches, and people don't really listen when a politician tells them something, so they had no way to enforce this. There was no special force. The police didn't do shit. Right now everybody is sort of like trying to do something or to use their executive power to promote these ideas, but before it was more freelance. Like, it was recommended for you to stay at home, but nobody would do anything if you went out, right? And you cannot really give this choice to your people if it is this serious. And many governments also lack the infrastructure to do this if they wanted to, right? They either didn't have enough units to make these people stay at home, or to make people go to hospitals. At least in my country, maybe it's also the same in you. I know it's in Italy and maybe also in France. Hospitals are overstocked. People that have normal diseases, right? People who have like a broken hand or have an infection cannot get proper medical care because there are people going and testing themselves for coronavirus, and we have to wait 2 days before you actually get the results back, right? And some parts of the hospitals have been infected due to poor medical conditions, right? The doctors mishandled some samples or something, and suddenly you've got the coronavirus in the halls of the actual hallway, and you have to close them an entire wing, which only makes the problem go even worse. Now, in the future, I think that we should sit down and consult this, and not as a world, but I think countries together have to find a way or a protocol to use in order when this pandemic starts to spread. We cannot rely on individual countries making individual rules because that doesn't really work out most of the time. We have to rely on a general protocol that the countries will just utilize whenever something similar happens in the future, and therefore we can get a better safety. I could say that this corona thing is sort of like a test run, because I think there are going to be more serious pandemics in the future. There might be, right? And if we don't have a proper protocol in place, if we don't know what the fuck we are supposed to be doing, then it will be a real problem for us to solve issues. As I already said, imagine there would be a pandemic maybe 30 years from now that would infect 1/7 of the world, 1 billion, or could potentially affect 1 billion, right? And now imagine that pandemic would start to kill. Yeah, no, you would collapse on the ground and nobody could pick you up or do anything with you. You would just die automatically. That is something we have to worry about. And if we don't have protocols in place that we utilize, if we don't have people who are mentally prepared to follow these protocols when they are in place, then you have a pretty bad chance of surviving, and lots of people are gonna unfortunately die. I think that we could have handled Corona better, but this is the situation we are at now. We cannot talk about the past. I just think that the country should sit down maybe 2 months after this all calms down and talk about protocols, talk about measures, maybe utilize a united fund where we collect money. Because, for example, there is lackage of medical supplies, at least in my country, and people cannot get proper medical supplies. Who want to stay at home but, I don't know, don't have a disinfectant on their hands or don't want to do this. I think this would greatly help the entire pandemic and would make it less of a serious issue, so we can get back to our normal lives the sooner. And of course, we as individuals have to also become more disciplined. But I don't want to be the teacher or the preacher of this, because I was also on the camp that just made fun of Corona in the beginning. So I'm also quite guilty of this. And I don't want to moralize people like you aren't educated enough, because I as an individual aren't educated enough too, right? I was just as undisciplined like you or like most of the people were. So that would be the end of today's episode. I would like to thank you for listening, and one more time, sorry for the setup, sorry for the sound. Everything is just happening fast and I have to work with what I have, and unfortunately it's not the best quality, but I will try to make it enjoyable nonetheless. So thank you for listening and goodbye.